Frankenstein's monster, the artificial human created by Dr. Victor Frankenstein. But what about the Frankenstein of Fate Grand Order? How well does she compare to her literary counterpart, and what grade would I give her depiction? Let's find out. Before we go any further, we need to talk about names. You see, it is a common misconception that Frankenstein is the name of the character, when in fact it is not. This is not just an FGO thing. This has been an issue since the time of some of the oldest adaptations. Frankenstein is the last name of the creator, Dr. Victor Frankenstein. He did not give a name to his creation, finding himself utterly disgusted by it, and so the name typically given to the being he created is Frankenstein's monster. You actually get this sorted out very early on in Fate Apocrypha, with her rejecting the name and insisting on Berserker in one of her very first scenes. Later on in FGO, she accepts the nickname of Fran, probably because there are far too many Berserkers to simply call her by her class. For the purposes of this video, I too will call her by her nickname, Fran. Now with that out of the way, let's continue. As mentioned, Fran is a Berserker class servant, though one with a very low rank of Madness Enhancement, being at D rank. What does this mean? It means that, when compared to other Berserkers, Fran's brand of madness is quite tame, and to be perfectly honest, this is a good choice for them to have made. The reason why is because it is actually quite hard to figure out just what class the literary Fran could fall into. In the novel, Fran did kill a few people by strangling them with bare hands, but the character is quite clearly not insane, actually being quite intelligent. So giving Fran the Berserker class, but then noting that her level of madness is very low is probably the best the creators could have done. Moving on to character design, we now get to talk about the elephant in the room. That's right, Fran is the first character I have covered who has been gender flipped from their original source material. I've been pondering how I'd handle this whenever it would come up, and now it is time to deal with it. So to come out with it, when it comes to my accuracy grades, I am not going to automatically smack a character for being gender swapped. That would be deeply unfair to some of the characters who get gender flipped, but who are portrayed really, really well. Instead, what I will do is look into the gender swap, the justifications for it, and go from there. If the gender flip is done well, it falls under creative license and so won't get docked by me. Hell, the best cases might even get a bump in their grade if it is done really well. But for the characters who do it badly, or seem to have just flipped because reasons, that will hurt their grade. So where does Fran fall when it comes to justifying her own gender swap? Well, to my surprise, it is actually a pretty good one. You see, in the original story, Dr. Frankenstein created the male Fran, only to flee in disgust at what he had created. Later on, after having had to deal with the prejudices and fear of normal humans, the monster confronted the doctor and demanded that he make a female Fran. The monster wanted a spouse, someone like himself who he could then live with, and so not be completely alone in a hostile world. Dr. Frankenstein starts to work on a female monster, but then destroys it, fearing what might happen if he does so. Ultimately, both the Doctor and his creation meet a tragic end near the North Pole, with Dr. Frankenstein dying of hypothermia and Fran throwing himself upon the Doctor's funeral pyre. The story is actually really sad and depressing, and we see all of this, albeit in a gender-flipped form, in flashbacks during Fate Apocrypha. Anyway, my point in summarizing that bit of the original story is to say that the concept of there being a female monster does exist, and there would have been one had the Doctor not decided to destroy her partway. So for the Fate franchise to decide to play it so that the first monster would instead be the female one isn't completely out there. There is real cause for them to do this. So now that we are done with that, what about the rest of Fran's design? Well, we may not have a female monster from the original novel, but we do have a very old film adaptation that does. And, at a superficial level, there is some resemblance between Fran and this Bride of Frankenstein. She is notably less grotesque than the male monster, wears a white dress, and, if you take into account the movie poster since the movie itself is black and white, a reddish-orange hair color. At the same time, the stitched-together and green zombie-like appearance of the male Frankenstein is more a product of these films than the original novel. So in truth, Fran in FGO kinda resembles this Bride of Frankenstein, but with a more modern and detailed look. I mean, The Bride is from a 1935 movie, when we had leaders like FDR, Hitler, and Stalin, the good old days of a multipolar world. So the designers of FGO's Fran making some improvements from those days is kind of hoped for. But what about the rest of Fran's design? What about all those metal electrical bits? Well, the common story is that the monster was created by stitching together pieces from various corpses, and then brought to life through the use of electricity. This is more a creation of later adaptations of Mary Shelley's novel, with the original story giving more emphasis to Dr. Frankenstein's use of science rather than stitching body parts together, much less the big show of animating his creation with a huge surge of lightning. Still, I'll give the designers a pass for this, since while Mary Shelley was more subtle about it, the original monster really was brought to life through electricity. Popular culture just made it a bigger deal later on. As for her weapon, as I mentioned before, the original Fran didn't actually have one, doing his murders with his bare hands. But I guess someone decided that this would be boring, and so gave Fate's Fran this mace thing. Apparently, the head of this mace actually is where Fran's heart is. It is through this mace that mana is drawn from the surrounding area, and so is what keeps Fran alive. An interesting concept. The original Fran didn't need to be recharged, but servants do, so I guess I'll just roll with it. All in all, Fran's character design, despite the gender flip, actually does take elements from existing aspects of the original novel, as well as popular adaptations. It is actually better about this than I expected. Moving on to her skill set, Fran's first skill is galvanism. Now, galvanism is the term for creating electricity within biological organisms. This got its start in the late 1700s, and forms the basis of the process for how the monster was brought to life in the original novel. Fittingly, the skill increases Fran's MP gain for 3 turns. I think this skill speaks for itself. It is absolutely solid from a lore perspective, and a good game skill to boot. Fran's second skill is Wail of the Living Dead, which lowers a single enemy's defense and has a chance to stun them. To put it simply, this skill is meant to represent the terror that the monster can inflict upon a foe after a sufficiently loud shout, or in Fran's case more of a growl. Anyway, the monster's interactions with normal humans quite often led to terrified reactions and hostility, even without a wail to go with it. Fran wasn't trying to cause these reactions, but their appearance made it so. It was Fran's inability to make connections with others that ultimately led them to loneliness and despair. Lastly, her third skill is Overload, which greatly improves her MP damage, but at the cost of inflicting burn damage to herself for 5 turns. Now this is meant to be Fran supercharging her energy, but is there any basis for this sort of skill in the original novel? No, there isn't. None whatsoever. After the initial awakening, there is no further involvement of electricity in the plot, much less the monster making use of it themselves. And relating to that, Fran's noble phantasm is Blasted Tree, a massive electrical overload that blasts out from her mace into the shape of a tree. Now, as I stated with the Overload skill, there isn't any real basis in the original novel for the monster making use of electricity after its initial awakening, much less to use the electricity as a weapon. The name, however, actually does mean something. In Dr. Frankenstein's youth, he witnessed a lightning strike upon an oak tree, setting it ablaze. This would later come into his thoughts when he decided to use galvanism, electricity, to bring life to his creation. Now, while I did just completely smack both Fran's third skill and her MP because the original didn't use lightning after coming to life, I do have to make one statement, and that is, what else could the designers have done? The story of Frankenstein's monster is a tragic tale of a being brought to life, utterly rejected by the world, and ultimately ending their own life in despair. The monster does attack people, strangling a few people close to Dr. Frankenstein to get back at him for his mistreatment, but that's it. So unless the designers wanted an MP where Fran just strangles someone, there isn't really a good choice for an MP. So while Fran's MP might not have any basis in the original story, it's not like there's some other clear choice that the devs simply chose to overlook. They gave us what they could come up with. Fran's craft essence is Procedure to Humanity, depicting a gravestone being struck by a rush of purple lightning. Now, I don't know why the hell the lightning is purple, but the graveyard is something. As mentioned before, the monster was created by using bits from corpses, and in past adaptations the Doctor actually did go dig up bodies in graveyards in order to get those pieces. In other words, the Procedure to Humanity being referenced to is the process of creating the monster in the first place, which is further highlighted in the text of the craft essence. This is a good choice. Moving on to Fran's characterization, like Jean before her, Fran was also in Fate Apocrypha, serving as the berserker for the Black Faction. She is a servant of few words, mostly communicating through grunts or growls. Now, Fran is not unintelligent. In fact, based on internal monologue bits we get from both Apocrypha and FGO, she is actually pretty smart. But she has difficulty speaking, and so does not do it often or keeps her lines short. Her personality is shy, fittingly shown visually by how her hair almost always hides her eyes. She does seem to develop some connection to her master, Cowlus, but we only get a little bit of this. But, during the first major battle in Apocrypha, Fran has the misfortune of running into some dangerous opponents that outclass her. First, she ends up fighting the master, Shiro Kotamine. actually Amako Sashiro, before he moves on to his next objective. Then Fran gets sent into a mental breakdown thanks to Shakespeare. Once she recovers from Shakespeare's assault, she ends up charging the next closest opponent she can find, which turns out to be Mordred, one of the most dangerous servants in Apocrypha. Mordred makes short work of Fran, much like she did with Astolfo and Sieg just before Fran attacked. Fran ends up overloading her MP, Blasted Tree, in an attempt to take down Mordred in a kamikaze attack, but it fails, leaving Mordred wounded, but still capable of fighting the rejuvenated Sieg using Siegfried's powers afterwards. It really was just one moment of bad luck after another for Fran, coming up against a series of opponents that were just too dangerous for her to handle. Of the 16 servants in Apocrypha, Fran was the second one to fall after Siegfried, and even he got to live on through Sieg. Still, we did at least get some material from Fran in Apocrypha. Her most notable scene undoubtedly was that awful sequence with Shakespeare, where she is forced to relive her past, and have it contrasted by an illusion of a Dr. Frankenstein who is actually friendly to her. The discrepancy between Shakespeare's illusion and her own memories drives Fran mad, leading her to kill the illusion and cause a mental breakdown severe enough that it takes a command spell to fix. But during those visions we get to see Fran's story, which more or less mirrors what is in the original novel. She is brought to life, but the Doctor is horrified by her appearance. Fran then demands that Dr. Frankenstein make her a spouse, but when this hope fails she ends her life on the Doctor's funeral pyre. Fran's experiences of rejection at the hands of the Doctor and other humans is no doubt at the root of her guarded personality. When she does manage to find someone who accepts her, she is able to forge a close bond with them. She doesn't really get enough time with Cowlus, her master in Apocrypha, to make a solid connection, but that changes once we get into Fate Grand Order. Fran's first appearance in FGO is in the London Singularity, though as it turns out this is not the servant Fran, but the real one. She is found in Dr. Frankenstein's estate by the protagonist, Mash, and their local ally in London, who is none other than Mordred. But unlike in Apocrypha when Fran and Mordred were on opposing sides of a conflict, the two of them forge a close bond with each other that resurfaces again and again whenever they meet in future FGO events. She also has fond memories of meeting with Charles Babbage, but unfortunately he gets warped into an enemy by the Grail and has to be defeated. Fran and Babbage rekindle their friendship later during the events of Summer 2, and are joined by Moriarty of all people. Fran starts acting as Moriarty's surrogate daughter, which puts Moriarty in the bizarre situation of not being his usual evil self. Now this might just be summer event shenanigans at play, but it is still yet another person Fran has found a friend in. Considering her tragic life story, Fran's primary wish for the Grail was to have a spouse for herself. But once she is part of Chaldea, Fran ends up finding the companionship that she sought out and failed to get in life. Since she has gotten her wish fulfilled, Fran has become a staunch ally of Chaldea and those who she forms bonds with. A good place you can see this is during the Imaginary Scramble event. When one of the Outer Gods tries to tempt her, Fran rejects it outright because that Outer God is hurting her new friend, Van Gogh. It is actually quite heartwarming. The monster who was once abandoned by her creator and the rest of humanity has finally found a place she can call home. The world may still be in terrible danger, but Fran has already found something like a happy ending. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Fran's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, it is better than I expected, actually. I've heard more than a few people react negatively to Fran, particularly to her being gender-flipped. While whether or not she should have been made female is a matter of taste, the fact is it still works from a lore perspective, and so isn't just a change made because people wanted a cute monster girl. I mean, it could also be because of that, but my point is this is a gender swap that works. As for her kit, it is mostly good, with the only real issues being more a product of there just not being good options to choose from. As for her characterization, I find it to be solid. People might take issue with Fran not being some horrible monster, but in the original story, Fran only truly became a monster due to the mistreatment and rejection of others. They wanted to form bonds with people, but kept getting attacked solely for their grotesque appearance. But since Fran in FGO is able to finally find people who are willing to accept her, we get a more gentle and friendly being that she likely would have been in the original novel had she not been so rejected. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Fran, or Frankenstein's monster, a B+. I'm honestly surprised by how well Fran links to the source material. I do hope I find more pleasant surprises like this in the future. Anyway, that's all for this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time.